Well, good evening. This is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story. Hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at, illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality, not illusion or delusion, that'll determine what the future will bring. And I have to remind you the views that are expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of this station. They're my views, the views of our guests, the views of our callers, and of course we welcome your calls from out across America at 1-888-24-LIBERTY, or here in the Central Coast of California at 464-8295. But please hold your calls because we have with us Dr. Colin Ross, and we're going to be talking about the Bluebird. We're going to be talking about really Operation Bluebird, a CIA operation that was designed to study about how you could create mental illness in unsuspecting Americans. And of course this is based, well, I'm going to let him tell you how he got into this. It's a fascinating study. Dr. Ross is a psychiatrist. He's practicing. He's been dealing with this for 20 years. And his story is, well, something every American should hear. Good evening. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Why don't you tell our listeners just a little bit about yourself? I know you were graduated in Canada, but just sort of give us a quick rundown, and then how you got involved in dealing with dissociative personalities, and really what a dissociative personality is.
Okay. Well, I always wanted to be a psychiatrist since I was a kid, actually, and I took a sort of roundabout route, ended up getting to medical school, and finished medical school, and then went into psychiatry. When I was a third-year medical student, I was doing my rotation in psychiatry, and I independently diagnosed somebody as having multiple personality disorder. And that's really, I was kind of very, very vaguely aware of it before that, and that's how I got interested in it. And I just read literature and started writing about it myself, and there's no looking back from that point on.
Well, now, explain to our listeners, will you please, what is a dissociative personality?
Well, it used to be called multiple personality disorder, like Sybil in The Three Faces of Eve. And then in '94, the name was officially changed to dissociative identity disorder. Same thing, basically.
Well, are these people with really two entirely different personalities?
Well, yes and no. It's not literally true that there's more than one person living inside the same body, or that there's more than one person there. But their identities are fractured or fragmented into these different people, quotes, who take turns being in control of the body and don't always remember what the other ones have been doing.
And of course, this really is the personality's response to deal with something that is just too horrible to contemplate. Is that would be a fair statement?
Yeah, it's basically a survival coping strategy when there's too much abuse, neglect, violence, chaos, trauma going on in childhood. The basic idea is simple, just this is too much, I'm out of here, somebody else can deal with this.
All right. Now, of course, the difficult thing for, I think, many people to understand is that the Central Intelligence Agency many years ago set out to figure out how they could create this sort of a situation in people, and they actually contracted with psychiatrists and medical schools to actually create personality disorders in their patients. And of course, these studies were done. They were published in peer-reviewed journals. And the amazing thing is, nobody seemed to think there was anything wrong with creating mental disease.
It is very amazing. And I first got into this when I moved from Canada to Dallas in late '91. And early in '92, some patients started telling me stories. And that one actually gave me some declassified documents about, as kids, being on bases or being in hospitals and having very odd scientific experiments done on them with EEG machines, LSD, physical spinning, memorization experiments, sensory deprivation, wearing strange goggles, and so on, all to create these new artificial identities, basically create an artificial multiple personality. And so, of course, I didn't know whether that was real or not real, or what to think of it, really. And I decided to start doing a whole lot of reading and research. And that's how I got into writing the book, Bluebird.
Well, now, of course, a lot of this was based, though, upon information you got from the Central Intelligence Agency and the Freedom of Information Act, isn't it?
Yeah, I have around about 15,000 pages of documents from the CIA from Freedom of Information. And then I've got a whole cabinet full of papers, mostly from the 50s and 60s, that I photocopied from medical journals. In the medical journals, it really stops in the early 70s, but up until the early 70s, you can read all kinds of insane experiments, LSD experiments, electroshock, all kinds of unusual things. And it'll say at the bottom of the paper, funded by the Office of Naval Research or the Department of the Army or the Office of Naval Research. So I was able to document very extensive funding of all kinds of mind control experiments. And then they never quite had the gall to put in the medical journals that was funded by the CIA. But I got all of that from the Freedom of Information Act.
Well, of course, the thing was that they were using hypnosis and drugs, and they were using electric shock, various types of trauma-based affairs to actually create mental illness in people just to see what would happen. What about the ethics of something like that?
Well, there are no ethics. There's several angles I take on this. I'm basically not an anti-government or anti-CIA guy as such. I'm really a civilian psychiatrist. My focus is on psychiatry, mental illness, how to help patients, and the ethics of psychiatry. And this is basically an absolutely documented, systematic, pervasive violation of human rights and basic medical ethics by all the major leading medical schools, many of the grandfathers of psychiatry throughout the second half of the 20th century. So I was always told about, in the Soviet Union, they used psychiatry for political purposes, and they put people in jail when they're just political radicals, or put them in mental hospitals and pretend they're mentally ill, and we never do that there. It was a very holier-than-thou kind of attitude. But we, North American psychiatry, have done horrendous things to patients without really following them systematically to see the harm, without real informed consent, and really up to the level of Nazi atrocities.
Well, didn't we actually bring some of the Nazi psychiatrists who'd done these macabre things in their concentration camps to America under Operation Paperclip and allow them to continue their studies here?
Well, that's something I want to find out more about. What happened at the end of the Second World War is, as the war was winding down, a lot of the German scientists were being captured and put in camps and so on. And then immediately after the war, there was a big scramble between the Russians, French, British and Americans to get all these scientists and bring them back home. And the problem that the U.S. had was a lot of them were documented Nazi war criminals. So therefore the State Department wouldn't issue them visas. So they set up a series of programs, the most famous of which is Paperclip, to bring these people over, basically routing them around the State Department visa requirements. This included Wernher von Braun, the major figures in the NASA rocket team, medical doctors, all kinds of propulsion, ball bearing, film, aviation experts of all kind. The only people who are missing from the documentation is the psychiatrists. And there had to have been psychiatrists in the group. So that's something I would like to see brought out in public and documented.
No, I think, of course, they really don't want the American people to realize the crass indifference to humanity. Really, the Operation Paperclip, and for our listeners that don't know what it was, this was the symbol. If you were working in intelligence and you saw one of these files, and they always put a paperclip on it, that meant that they were to be passed over and brought into this country, ignoring their crimes against humanity under the Nazi regime. And
right.
Of course, it was felt that, we need these people here because, after all, we're involved now in the war with the evil communists, and so we have to bring in these evil people to help us fight the evil communists. And of course,
even if you bought that argument, which I don't exactly buy, the problem is, from a medical ethics point of view, these people come over to the country and then they massively violate basic medical ethics, and everybody looks the other way, doesn't comment, lets it slide by. That's what really makes me angry.
Well, the thing is, it was not only the Nazis, but these were Americans. A lot of these were American psychiatrists trained in our schools with relativism, where a right and wrong there really is no right and no wrong. And so, some of the things in your book where you actually quote from the CIA files about these psychiatrists using electric shock, just to see what would happen. When it really wasn't called for, or using excessive electric shock. That was and intentionally trying to destroy memory or destroy personalities.
Well, they were very successful, and overusing really understates it. And Linda MacDonald, who's a very well-documented case from McGill University, which is in Montreal, which is basically the leading Canadian university and was the leading Canadian medical school and department of psychiatry. The head of the department, Ewan Cameron, was a CIA contractor. That's all documented. He was the guy who founded the World Psychiatric Association. He was president of the Canadian and American Psychiatric Associations. Very well-connected guy politically. And he was part of the team that went over and interviewed all of the Nazi doctors for the Nuremberg trials. And by the time Linda MacDonald arrived at his hospital in 1963, the CIA funding had dropped out and was picked up by the Canadian government.
No, this was up in Canada.
Yeah, in McGill. And because most of the CIA contracting was done in the United States, some in Canada, some overseas. The overseas was mostly under a program called MK Delta, and the U.S. and Canadian was under MK Ultra. But at any rate, Linda MacDonald came into the hospital, and under funding from the Canadian government, he gave her between... she was admitted in March, but the actual shock therapy started in May.
Now, this was Dr. Cameron, of course, the psychiatrist, the prominent Canadian psychiatrist.
Yeah, and he started from May to September. He gave her 102 shock treatments, each of which delivered 6 times the normal dose of electricity to her brain. On top of that, kept her asleep for weeks with drugs and played tape loops to her over and over and over and over and over. At the end of this period of time, she was incontinent of urine and feces, didn't know her name, didn't know where she was, didn't know what year it was, couldn't recognize her husband or her children. And she gradually, over a period of 3-6 months, got back her normal abilities and was able to function.
But she didn't have any memory.
Absolutely no memory from the time she was admitted to the hospital back to birth, from 1963 until the present. She hasn't recovered any of that memory at all. So this is just Nazi-level experiments to wipe out somebody's memory, done on contract to the CIA, obviously.
Without the knowledge or consent of the individual.
No real consent.
And certainly with the full knowledge of psychiatrists, it wasn't just Dr. Cameron. Obviously, the people in your Canadian government had to know about it, and certainly the CIA probably knew about it, didn't they?
And, oh yeah, they didn't only know about it, they paid for it. And why an intelligence agency would want to figure out how to wipe out somebody's memories doesn't take too long to figure out, right? But the just most appalling thing is, not only did doctors in the government, other doctors in McGill know about it, but it was published in mainstream medical journals. American Journal of Psychiatry, Comprehensive Psychiatry. It's just like the Tuskegee syphilis study, which was published in mainstream medical journals. And I have a copy of that was a study that started in 1942, where 400 black guys in the rural South who all had syphilis were prevented from having any treatment. And the study was finally shut down under public protest in 1972. And it was run by the Center for Disease Control, U.S. Department of Public Health. The Surgeon General knew about it. The American Heart Association knew about it.
But of course, for our listeners out there, these were 400 black men who had syphilis, who, of course, were recruited for a study, and they were told they were going to be treated for their bad blood, as it were.
Right.
But they really weren't being recruited to be treated. They were recruited not to be treated,
right,
so they could just find out what syphilis would do to ravage their bodies and destroy their minds.
And lo and behold,
right,
they found out that these guys died earlier and had more illness. And the results of the journal, I have a 1965 article called Untreated Syphilis in the Male Negro from a mainstream medical journal. And this violated absolutely all ethical conventions going back to Nuremberg. But it was the nurse who was the main person running the study.
Nurse Rivers.
Yeah, she received a Lifetime Service Award from the Public Health Service.
She refused it, or she received it?
She received it.
She received it for this great work. She was black, and she betrayed all these black men.
Right.
And of course, every time they would go into a clinic, any place, to try to get treatment, why, she would, of course, carry out her orders. She was just carrying out her orders.
Right.
She would notify them that these were special people. They were not to be treated. And, of course, what happened was that the fellow, in fact, a friend, a gentleman I've interviewed many times, Peter Buxton, who was working as doing venereal disease histories while waiting to get into law school, working at the public health clinic in San Francisco, heard about this, and he was horrified.
Right.
And so he wrote some letters. Well, that's an entirely different story, but he wrote letters back east.
Basically, it was him as an individual that brought this out into public and got the study shut down. It was one man.
One man. And, of course, what was really so frightening to me about this, Dr. Ross, though, was that CDC then convened a group of professors from medical schools, and there were 11 of them, and said, is there anything immoral about, this wonderful scientific experiment? Think all we're going to learn about this? Just withholding intentionally treatment for a treatable disease.
Right.
And 10 of them said there was nothing wrong with it. One man stood up and said, this is immoral. What you're doing is wrong. But the other 10, and they're the people that we look to as the leaders of organized medicine and medical teaching, and these are the people who are teaching our doctors, about ethics. And they said there's nothing wrong with it. And it wasn't until the public found out that this thing stopped.
Exactly, and that's the climate that allows all this mind control experimentation to go on. It says, look the other way, don't rock the boat, might be bad for my career if I say anything, or, gee, maybe I might want to get one of those grants sometime myself, and I see that the guys who get those grants get promotions. That's the way the whole system works, basically.
Well, you can't be very, very popular having, written a number of books on this subject, but for our listeners out there, Dr. Ross's book, and we carry it, is called Bluebird, and to take off on the name Operation Bluebird, one of the first CIA mind control experiments, and then and then of course it became Artichoke, and it became, I've forgotten what they
MK Ultra,
right.
And then MK Search,
and they keep changing the name, so you can't figure out what they're really doing. But there are a lot of these victims out all across America. Now, let's talk about Linda. How did they ever find out what really happened, and what did eventually happen to her?
Well, exactly why from when I was doing all the background reading for this, I learned a bit about how CIA operates and how intelligence operates. And I learned some of their jargon. So there's one thing they do is called a limited hangout. It's a disinformation strategy. So they let out a little part of the truth in order to cover up the greater part. So they say, hey, we came clean, here's all there is. Okay, that's it. Now we're not going to do that anymore. But actually, it's a deliberate strategy to keep the other 95% hidden. And so I'm thinking, I can't prove, I have no documents at all, but I'm thinking that somehow there was a decision to do a limited hangout with Ewan Cameron, because he died in 1967. The experiments were done in Canada, so the jury awards wouldn't be as big. And what happened then was the news was broken on a CBC News magazine type program. And Linda McDonald, this is now almost 25 years after her treatment, quotation marks, treatment at McGill, she saw that on Canadian TV and realized that she'd been a victim of some kind of crazy experimentation, got herself a lawyer, and the lawyer ended up getting her $100,000 tax-free from the Canadian government in compensation. And also they set up a fund for all other survivors of those experiments, who they now automatically all get $100,000 each.
But how many of them were there? Do we have any idea?
The figure that's always said in public is 80 for that particular set of experiments.
No, but that was just one set of experiments.
So that's a drop in the bucket. Yeah.
Supposedly we're fighting communism. We're fighting the evil communists. But, if we have this sort of people that's working at the highest echelons of our government, and they would do that to American citizens, well, what else would they do? We're going to explore a lot more about this. And I just want to comment, there was a movie series recently called The Pretender. And it was about a young boy who was experimented on in this similar manner. And everybody thought, gee, that's a great, fun program, The trouble is that when you talk to these people who've been in this program, that's exactly what happened. We'll be right back here with Dr. Colin Ross, and welcome your calls here at Radio Liberty. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and our guest this evening, Dr. Colin Ross. We're talking about the experiments, these macabre experiments that were done. Now, nobody in our government has ever been held responsible for this, and they simply. But the thing is, it's not simply even the CIA. It was widely known by our the doctors working in the medical schools who were getting these big fancy grants to carry on these macabre experiments. And they saw nothing morally wrong with them. And this is what happens when you have lost your concept of right and wrong, that there are absolutes, that there is a God, that we're answerable to a higher being for what we do. But if there is no God, what's really wrong with this sort of thing, especially if it gets you a grant and it gets you promotions? And so have you ever talked to anybody who has sort of commented on this story that was on television called The Pretender?
Like, you mean a government official or?
No, I'm just talking to the people. I've talked to several people who've been in these various mind-controlled units, and they say, well, The Pretender, I don't know whether you ever saw the program.
Yeah, I have seen it. Actually, the thing about The Pretender is it's a very mild version of reality.
A very mild?
What's in the documents is the declassified documents, obviously, are only the tip of the iceberg. But what's in the declassified documents is way more severe, destructive, and unethical than anything in the Pretender program.
Well, why don't you tell us really what they do? Because they've used children a lot, and you've talked to these people, these children that, have been victims of these experiments. Why do they want children?
Well, you're starting to get out beyond the declassified documents now, but they do describe experimentation on children. And for instance, the Office of Naval Research funded a neurosurgeon at Yale, Jose Delgado, who published papers describing putting brain electrode implants in children as young as 11, and then using a remote transmitter box to stimulate those electrodes to control their behavior. He could get kids to sort of stare into space with a goofy expression on, fly into a rage, behave normally. And that's all absolutely documented, funded by the military. There's a very revered child psychiatrist named Loretta Bender, and her funding sources are not stated in her papers, but she had kids, this is in the 60s at Creedmoor State Hospital in New York, she had kids age 5 to 10 on street-level doses of LSD and psilocybin for days, weeks, months, and in some cases years at a time.
No, these were children in a hospital for mentally defective children, or what?
Yeah, psychiatric disorders.
All right. And
which would be mostly depression and attention deficit disorder, things like that.
So they use these children for medical experiments without their permission, without permission of their parents, just to see what's going to happen.
Right, based on really crazy, unscientific theories of how the brain works. And in the radiation experiments, the school was called, if I remember right, Fernald School for the Mentally Retarded, I think. It was in New England. And they were putting radiation in cereal that these retarded kids were eating, and they directly told the parents that it was vitamins. So sometimes not only did they kind of tiptoe around the subject, they outright deliberately lied. One of the doctors who was involved in the brain electrode implant programs at Harvard was also involved in radiation experimentation. And in the report that Clinton commissioned, there's about a 900-something page advisory panel report to Clinton. They described this Dr. Sweet at Harvard injecting radioactive plutonium into a guy.
We're going to have to interrupt you. We'll be right back here in just a moment. But well, this is Dr. Stan, and our guest this evening, Dr. Colin Ross, is a practicing psychiatrist, and he works with dissociated personalities. These people who have had split personalities, and of course, the reason you have a split personality is because reality has become so horrible you can't face it. The trouble is that some of these dissociative personalities have been intentionally created by your tax dollars. By the CIA, and of course they keep saying, "Oh, well, we did that in the past, but we'd never do that again." And if you believe that, you probably believe your Enron stock is going to come back again. But, ladies and gentlemen, the tragedy is that at least we have the documentation. And Dr. Ross, in his book Bluebird, has summarized the 15,000 pages of testimony he was able to get under the Freedom of Information Act, much of it redacted, because they don't want the public to know, but enough frightening and terrifying information there that, if they would let this through, think of the things that they're not going to let you know about. And, of course, the criminal activity, these people, in my estimation, these physicians should be exposed for what they've done. But, of course, well, you're not going to read about this ordinarily in our major medical journals. So, and certainly not in most of our major news magazines or newspapers. So anyway, it's up to Dr. Ross, and he's done a great job. The book, Bluebird, going into the background of this government program, which became Artichoke, became MK Ultra, became something else, always changing the name, but never changing the diabolical nature of it. And Dr. Ross was telling us about some of the people that these macabre things have been done to. So would you want to pick up the story there?
Sure. It was this Dr. William Sweet, who was part of the brain electrode team at Harvard that was funded by the Navy. He also was involved in these radiation experiments, so he injected plutonium into this guy who arrived at emergency department in Harvard.
Now, did the fellow know he was going to be given the plutonium?
Well, this is where it comes down to lying, because William Sweet testified that everybody gave informed consent, but this one guy arrived unconscious. His identity wasn't known. He was injected with plutonium experimentally, and he died without regaining consciousness. So it just goes on and on and on and on.
Well, dead men, that just goes to show you the truth of the fact that dead men tell no tales, and they can't even very well sue you for what you've done to them.
Right.
But of course, and then you commented that they were feeding cereal laced with plutonium to the children at these state hospitals, and telling the parents it was vitamins. And, of course, they knew that these were macabre experiments. And yet, of course, they did this. There were other experiments where they gave the children hepatitis, just to see what would happen, various types of hepatitis. And there is nothing is ever done for the violation of people's rights. Of course, up in Canada, apparently, they at least had the decency to pay some of these people. And I know that there's one case here.
I think that it was maybe partly out of decency, but it took a lot of pressure, and I think the Canadian government was really boxed into that by the limited hangout strategy of the CIA. They bucked it and fought it and resisted it and downplayed it and set up commissions to downplay it for quite a few years before anybody got compensation.
Well, here in the United States, we gave, I think, each one of the black men that we let to have the syphilis, and those that survived, were not killed by the syphilis. We gave them $10,000.
No, not at first.
No, I know, but eventually.
Eventually, yeah, there was a class action suit. But what they got, the study started in 42. At the 25-year mark of the study, they all got a certificate from the Surgeon General of the United States thanking them for participation and a check for $25, $1 for each year of participation.
Right. Yeah, down the line, of course, when this whole, but, of course, here, the victims of 9/11, why they're going to give them each $1 million. Of course, that's with a promise that they won't sue the airlines or the Saudi Arabian or the Iraqi government for their involvement in that. But, they weren't quite as generous a few years ago. But then, of course, then a dollar was worth a lot more than it is today.
Well, yeah, but it was $1 per year. I don't think the dollar was...
No. I was speaking eventually. I think they eventually did get 10,000, didn't they?
Actually, they got more than that. They got... I can't remember the total number of survivors and families at that point, but it was a 10 million class action settlement.
Right.
Yeah.
But by the time the lawyer got through, then they could have gotten a lot more. But I don't want to get into what the lawyer did. But he just sort of knuckled under. He got his fee, and there wasn't an awful lot left over for the people who were involved.
Right. The worst thing about that Tuskegee syphilis study was those guys had unprotected intercourse with a lot of women for 40 years, and it's absolutely 100% guaranteed that children were born with syphilis as a result of that experiment.
Well, there is an attitude among certain of our elite that just because they're black, you just don't treat them the same way as you do others. They don't want to admit that they're racist, but this is the ultimate in racism. And, of course, every one of the people is black. If everyone had been white, do you think this would have gone on?
A lot of the mind control experiments were on terminal cancer patients, sex offenders, drug addicts, prisoners, mental patients.
Right. Well, we're going to have to take our break here at the half hour, and we'll be right back. This is Dr. Stan back here, and our guest this evening is Dr. Colin Ross, and we're talking about his book, Bluebird. And Dr. Ross actually deals with a lot of people with dissociative personalities, and many of them, of course, had come to him and had started telling him these stories. And as he listened to these stories, I think when you first heard this, that these people claimed they'd been victims of mind control, did you initially think they must have been just a little bit loony, that they all say that these were victims of a government mind control program?
Yeah, basically I thought they were probably delusional, because I didn't have any knowledge of this. Right?
Well, the average individual wouldn't. And
No.
for somebody who had walked into my office and told me that, and I'd say, well, obviously this is just crazy. You need to see a psychiatrist, but you are the psychiatrist.
That's right. Yeah. Well, the typical example you hear just in general in life, and you hear it in psychiatry textbooks, and you hear it from your professors, is, now, you can tell somebody's insane for sure if they come and explain that they're a victim of CIA experiments or that the FBI is after them. Well, in 1970, I forget if it was 75 or 76, the General Counsel for the U.S. Army in Senate testimony released a list of 130 different compounds that the Army had tested in mind control experiments, which included LSD and BZ and many other different types of drugs. And they admitted at that time, the Army, to testing LSD on 1,500 different people. So obviously that's not all of them. That's the tip of the iceberg again. But if you take 1,500 people on LSD, and you multiply that by 130 different compounds, and you figure they didn't release the names of all the compounds, you're up in the hundreds of thousands of people who got at least one dose of LSD or some other drug in a mind control experiment. Now, only a minority of those people would have been recruited into really serious, complicated mind control programs. But the number of U.S. citizens who've been involved in at least one unethical mind control experiment is minimum in the hundreds of thousands in the second half of the 20th century.
Well, let's get a little bit into some of the other things that you've certainly been dealing with. Now, one of the things that I've heard from, and I've talked to 4 different people who've told me that they had personally met Dr. Mengele. And for our listeners who don't know who Mengele is, he was the worst of all the Nazi doctors. He was known as the Angel of Death. He was the one who used to experiment on the children in the concentration camps. And I've got books written about him. And then, of course, he mysteriously disappears. And, he fled to South America. That's what happened to him. And this is what we're told. And yet I've talked to, at least myself, personally 4 people who've told me independently, without ever prompting, that they knew Dr. Mengele. Now, and that met him sometimes, many times. Have you ever encountered anybody who claims that they had met this Nazi butcher?
Yeah, I have actually. A small number of people like you. And again, initially you'd think, oh yeah, right, that's too much. These people must be insane. But it's an absolute documented fact that Klaus Barbie, who was called the Butcher of Lyon, he was a big Nazi atrocity guy. He was hidden and protected by the CIA. That's an absolutely documented fact. So, and the CIA and the military did bring all these other Nazi criminals over to the United States. So it's not really far-fetched that Goebbels could have been taken out somewhere and protected.
No, for our listener who thinks that this really is far-fetched, we have a book called The Gestapo Chief, and based on the memoirs of the head of the Gestapo. And you know where he went? He went to Berkeley in California. He traveled around America. He was brought here, given a fancy government job, eventually died in 1983. And we even have another book called The Mueller Diaries. His name was Heinrich Mueller. He headed the German Gestapo, and we know how terrible and evil they were. So why did we bring the head of the German Gestapo over here and give him a nice job? Oh, well, he was going to help us fight the wicked communists. That's what it was all about. And, of course, ladies and gentlemen, you have to understand that there are people who have a different sense of morality than the average individual. We carry that book, incidentally. It's called Gestapo Chief, and, of course, he correlated that the Mueller Diaries, and they're hard to get. Of course, the one thing is they don't want the American people to know that, why we might sort of get an idea that there were some wicked people in government, and certainly we wouldn't want the American people to get the wrong idea. So, of course, as you deal with these people, can you help them? Can you help them to overcome these problems, these split personalities, as we refer to them as?
Well, the people I work with clinically, they've basically developed 2, 3, 5, 10, 15 different characters inside. It's kind of divide and conquer strategy. There's just too much pain, too much terror, too much trauma, sadness, loneliness.
They have maybe 10 or 15 different personalities?
Yeah. And there's really no limit to it. You can create a whole kind of like Lord of the Rings internal fantasy world in your mind if you want, and have really no limit to the number of characters. But the number of identities that actually come out, take control of your body, and do stuff is fairly limited, just because there's not enough room in your life. But basically, the thing about this disorder is not that it's fascinating or bizarre or interesting, but that it's very treatable. These people, not all of them, and nobody can cure all of anything in psychiatry, but these people, if they work real hard in therapy and they stick with it and they deal with all the pain and learn more healthy coping strategies, they can be integrated back into one person, and their anxiety symptoms, their depression, their substance abuse, all their other types of addictions, self-mutilation, depression, all of that settles down. It's amazing to see the level of recovery that's possible.
Well, now, have you run into any of these people who claim that they're victims of satanic ritual abuse?
Yeah, I actually wrote a book published in '95 called Satanic Ritual Abuse, Principles of Treatment, because hundreds of people like that were coming through my program, and there's all this controversy. Is it real, not real, real memories, false memories? Is it coming from reality or coming from the therapist's imagination? So I read the existing literature on that, which is really small, and wrote a book. Basic idea of the book was, here's how you do therapy so that what you're doing and your strategies don't depend on whether the memories are real or not.
All right, fine. Well, of course, do you believe that there is such a thing as satanic ritual abuse?
Well, that's kind of a funny question.
Well, it's not a funny question. I think it's a very legitimate question.
It's not amusing, but well, I'll explain what I mean by it's a funny question. It depends what you call satanic. If you call a very organized, widespread human sacrifice cult that's driven by a warped theology satanic, then we've got two examples. The Catholic Inquisition, which tortured and burned a minimum of hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of witches, in a very systematic, organized way based on a theology. The second example that we know is the Third Reich. Those guys were driven by this sort of bizarre Aryan supremacy, sort of Teutonic mythology set of beliefs. A lot of those leading Nazis thought that they were incarnations of great leaders from hundreds of years ago, and they practiced some elements of Satanism, and they had a lot of rituals and symbols, and they obviously sacrificed a lot of people. So this is just the way human beings behave.
In other words, there's some people are very evil.
Yeah. Now, do we have objective evidence that human sacrifice has been widely practiced in North America? No. But there's nothing about it that's beyond what we know of serial killers, Nazis, and the Inquisition.
All right. So, but some of your people do come in and complain of that they are victims of satanic ritual abuse.
Oh yeah, lots. Yeah.
All right. Now, of course, then we get into something. Of course, it's the false memory syndrome. And the false memory syndrome, I'd never even heard of it till I got started doing talk radio back in 1994, and family called, and they said that family had been really, of course, had become the victims of local psychologists planning ideas in their daughter's memory, and of course they had been accused and they had been sued for, being part of some sort of a satanic cult, or I've forgotten the exact details of the story, but under any circumstances, they had been victimized by this false memory. And so then we saw the videos put out by the False Memory Association, and there were, of course, they have meetings and they have all these psychiatrists, and they talk about how all these ideas of satanic ritual abuse are all false memories implanted by psychologists, and perhaps some of them are. But one of the things you pointed out in your book isn't it interesting that many of these psychiatrists who talk about the false memory are exactly the same psychiatrists who are paid by the CIA, and you have the document to do all these macabre things that you've described?
Yeah, and that's no coincidence. I'm absolutely convinced that's part of a disinformation program and everybody covering their own butts in academia. So two of the guys who are, the organization is called the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. It's got a professional and scientific advisory board. And that's really the group of people who spearheaded the attack in psychiatry on the validity of multiple personality disorder. They're saying it's just a bogus diagnosis, and have been spearheading, it's all false memories. And so it turns out that two of the guys on the professional advisory board, both of whom died in the last few years, Martin Orne and Jolly West, were CIA MK Ultra contractors with top secret clearance, and their own personal projects had to do with hypnosis, dissociation, multiple personality, and the Manchurian Candidate programs.
All right, and I think that, so what you're basically saying is that the false memory syndrome movement was an effort to cover, the things that were done. Now, do you think that there actually have been some psychologists and their enthusiasm have implanted false memories in people?
Definitely. Oh, yeah, I've testified in court cases that this is an example of a way out of control therapy that's implanted false memories of satanic ritual abuse and other kinds of false memories. And I don't think the False Memory Syndrome Foundation is just one thing. I think it's a group of different interests. One is a whole bunch of parents who, in fact, were falsely accused of things they didn't do. Then there's another group that's a bunch of basically memory researchers who are all interested in how memory works. And then there's probably a group of people who are just kind of ugly people. And then there's a group who are the Manchurian Candidate contractors, their colleagues, their friends. And they've kind of co-opted the false memory movement to try and discredit multiple personality and cover up the Manchurian Candidate programs.
All right. Now, I think that the Manchurian Candidate program is one of the most important things I learned from your book. And, of course, for the listener out there who doesn't remember, the Manchurian Candidate, based upon a story, a movie, it was a book, and then it was a movie. And, of course, the whole idea, these American POWs have been captured by the Koreans. They've been sent back here. But, of course, they had been brainwashed in the meantime, and one of them was a Manchurian Candidate. His job, I think, was to assassinate the president, something like that.
A presidential candidate.
Right, of course. And Angela Lansbury played the villain, and, of course, she would trigger the Manchurian Candidate by turning over the Queen of Hearts, Queen of Diamonds, I've forgotten. Queen of Diamonds it was.
Right.
So basically, then we're told, well, gee, because the wicked communists had been working on the creating Manchurian candidates, we had to do all these experiments to so we would understand how to counter that sort of thing and recognize Manchurian candidates, and that perhaps POWs who had been brainwashed and hypnotized and could be triggered. And so, a lot of people would say, well, gee, the communists are doing this. Why, we've got to do these things to counter them. What's the counter to that remark, or that premise?
There's three counters to that premise. Number one, a psychologist named G.H. Estabrooks, I've got a lot of documents to back this up, including his own writings. The psychologist G.H. Estabrooks was creating Manchurian candidates for operational use by the War Department during the Second World War. So that's point number one.
Now, long before the Korean War.
Way before. Yeah. And Bluebird, the first in a series of mind control programs, was signed into existence by the director of the CIA in April 1950, and the Korean War didn't start until June 1950. And the first book on Korean brainwashing, Communist Chinese brainwashing, was written by a CIA officer named Edward Hunter. And he describes in his book that the level of brainwashing used by the Communist Chinese was a mild version of a much more sinister and complicated type of brainwashing. And the only way he could have known that is from U.S. programs.
Oh, my friend, I actually have Edward Hunter's book. I didn't realize he was a CIA operative at the time, and I still have several copies of it. So it's these are the sort of things that I learned from talking to my guest, that I read Hunter's book many years ago on brainwashing. And it certainly told of how with sleep deprivation and with this constant pressure on these people, you could get these young men just to totally break down.
And he actually had two terms. The whole book he mentions brainwashing all the time, but the more sinister, more complicated level, he called that brain cleansing.
Right. So
which is what happened to Linda McDonald. Her brain was cleansed of 26 years of memories.
Right, and of course this is what your tax dollars were used for here in the, and it's so difficult for the average American to believe that we, who are supposedly based upon a philosophy, that officials in our government would do something that evil.
And I know you're focused on the government. I don't want to lose the focus on the medical profession, the psychiatrists, and the universities, because they're equally in this. All these programs could not be run without doctors cooperating and running them.
And you're so right. And of course, the real problem is the fact that we've lost a moral foundation, a sense of right and wrong, and the dignity of the human. And trained in medicine, you're to respect individuals. You're to respect their rights. You go into medicine to help people.
You go into medicine to help people, but you're soon taught that human beings are biological machines. That's the basic philosophy that dominates biological psychiatry today.
Oh, and of course, the thing is that we do not teach the morality to our young doctors today. I still try to keep up with what goes on in my medical community, and there's no longer that wonderful spirit of medicine that was there when I was there and practiced for 40 years. This idealism, it seems to be, it just isn't there. What they've done is they've destroyed medicine. It's no longer a profession; it's a business, and people are so busy looking over their shoulder and filling out government paperwork and worried about the government coming in and stealing everything they've ever had because they filled out a form wrong, and they can charge you with all these things and force you to confess to something you haven't done. And so we've really destroyed, but part of it is the medical school training, and then part of it is society itself that has repudiated these concepts of right and wrong, and everything is relative. We've got Mike calling in here. Hi, Mike. Did you have a question or comment?
A couple things. Speaking of Harvard, I wonder if your guest knows anything about Richard Alpert.
Richard Alpert.
I believe that's where he
was
began.
One of the early LSD guys who was a buddy of Leary's, right?
Yeah, and he, I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, he was a professor at Harvard.
All right. Did you have any questions at all?
I just wondered if your guest knew anything about him. And
the LSD experimentation was developed and funded by the CIA and the Army. So all those guys who were early LSD researchers were either directly or indirectly funded by the CIA and the military.
Mm-hmm.
The first major supplier of LSD in North America was Eli Lilly Company, the manufacturer of Prozac. They got a top-secret MK Ultra grant in 1953 for $400,000 to manufacture and supply LSD. So all of that Harvard LSD would have been CIA LSD.
And of course, the other thing is, of course, they are also the ones that made the thimerosal, the mercury that has damaged so many children's brains. Anything else, Mike?
Yeah, one more. Ken Kesey began his work, which led, of course, to the electric Kool-Aid acid tests in the mid-'60s. He was...
Berg and a number of those other guys were turned on to LSD in LSD experiments run by psychiatrists funded by the CIA and the military, documented fact.
Mike, we're going to have to let you go. You're going to have to call another line because we got a terrible hum there, okay?
Okay.
Bye-bye. You can call back if you want to, but that was just a bad line. Anyway, of course, I remember Ken Kesey, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And, of course, this whole idea of, using lobotomy. Now, did the CIA finance the studies in lobotomy, too?
There's, in the Bluebird documents, there's a paragraph on one page called The Problem of Disposal of Subjects. And there's a discussion there about using lobotomy to dispose of mind control subjects.
In other words, so that they would not be able to respond, that they would not be able to tell people their affect, their memory, everything would be destroyed?
Right, exactly. One of the authors of The Three Faces of Eve, famous book on multiple personality,
right.
He described doing 200 lobotomies in a Georgia prison in one day. And he's got ties to a whole variety of MK Ultra mind control contractors.
Well, now, why would they do something like that? Would they do that simply because they wanted to change the hostility of the patients, or they just do it to see what would happen?
It's a mixture of all of the above. There's this kind of distorted, misguided, pseudoscientific idea that we're doing treatment. There's a sort of ghoulish, monstrous, mad scientist element to it. And then there's the CIA contractor side of it, all kind of mixed together.
Now, why would the CIA be so interested in lobotomies, doing lobotomies on people?
Well, it's just a way to neutralize somebody so they don't talk and tell. They describe, in the Bluebird and Artichoke documents, they describe people who've been used as assets, who are being held in prisons, who are being given basically a mixture of hypnosis, sensory deprivation, sodium amytal, alcohol, and barbiturates to erase their memories and implant false memories. That's very clearly described in the documents.
And they would actually then, intentionally create false memories in people of events that never happened.
Right.
Would you like to sort of describe the Manchurian Candidate? Because you talked about, how they would use, say, an officer or something as
Sure.
a courier. How does that work?
Well, the Manchurian Candidate is described, the actual sort of plot of the Manchurian Candidate movie is described exactly in Bluebird and Artichoke documents that came out half a decade before the movie. And in these other documents going back to War Department contracts in the Second World War. They don't go into a lot of detail on the actual techniques, but basically they take a susceptible subject, which means somebody who's probably a good hypnotic subject, and I believe somebody who with prior trauma, a lot of serious childhood trauma, who's already fragmented and dissociated internally. Then they use a variety of techniques that are in all the documents. That's hallucinogenic drugs, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, interrogation techniques, and so on. And they create a new identity. It's hidden behind an amnesia barrier, and then there's post-hypnotic signals to access the personality. So you'll call somebody into your office, and Estabrooks used the phrase, "the moon is clear." That would flip the person to his new identity. You then give him a classified piece of information, flip him back to his normal identity, send him on some benign trip to wherever. At the far end, another handler says the moon is clear, flips him to his new identity. He passes on the classified information. And then more a response is inserted, process is done in reverse. And these kind of people were used for courier and infiltration assignments, and in the Manchurian Candidate movie for assassination. The basic idea is they can be planted as sleepers for indefinitely. They can be activated with hypnotic signals. And if they're captured and interrogated, they genuinely have amnesia for the whole operation and can't spill the beans.
Well, no, because I was always taught when I was in medical school, well, you can't hypnotize anybody and get them to do anything they wouldn't do. You can't hypnotize people and get them to commit a crime. Is that true?
Well, to me, that's both a dumb question and actually a kind of disinformation strategy.
Well, looking back on it, I think that probably was, and I think even as a
Well,
young doctor,
I say that for a very simple reason. You can take any ordinary citizen, put him through boot camp, and turn him into a killer.
Right.
It's not a hard thing to do. It's very easy. And so if you add on to that really serious sensory deprivation and isolation, all kinds of drugs, hypnosis, physical spinning, induction of nausea, that's not the least bit difficult to imagine to me.
All right, fine. And so I think it's very difficult for a lot of our listeners to imagine that this sort of thing goes on in America. The tragedy is it does go on, and the fact that people don't know that is simply a reflection of the degree of control that today exists over what the American people think. Well, are there any other major points that we haven't touched on this hour?
Well, I think I'd like to mention non-lethal weapons. That's a whole set of different energy beams, electromagnetic radiation of various kinds, sound, infrasound, and so on. There's a whole program of weapons like that that have been described in detail in U.S. News and World Report, and they go all the way back to the primitive precursors that were developed in MK Ultra. And these weapons, I would say for sure, have been tested on unwitting civilians up to the present. And they either knock you out, make you sick, disable you, alter your state of consciousness or your behavior. Well, and that, again, there's got to be doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists involved in all of that. And again, it's absolutely against all medical ethics.
Well, we hear about some of these weapons that will make ideas come into your mind. Is there really something that'll actually do that? In the way of a beam or so that you'll actually hear something in your head?
Well, for sure, just a general buzzing or noise, being disoriented, being confused, or knocking you out. That's all documented, that's for sure. How fancy the technology is and whether you can monkey around with somebody at the level of specific thoughts, I don't know.
Well, we keep hearing these things, and of course, after talking to you for on several occasions, why some of the unthinkable seems to be, very real, and well, we'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, do you have any parting thoughts for our listeners?
Well, I think that the profession of medicine and psychiatry in particular really needs to be judged in public and needs to pay some consequences for all this and needs to come clean on it.
I agree with you totally. Thank you so much. Our guest has been Dr. Colin Ross. His book, Bluebird, if you'd like to know anything more about that, our telephone number, 1-800-544-8927. That's 1-800-5-HIV-WAR. Thank you so very much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Good night. God bless
Good night.
you. Well, that was Dr. Colin Ross. I hope you enjoyed the program. Usually we can evaluate how people feel by whether we're getting calls. And, of course, Mike's always a regular caller, but we know we have many listeners all over the Northwest. And I hope you enjoyed the program, and that's why you didn't call. Because this is information you must understand. And the book goes into, of course, to Saran, the man who killed Bobby Kennedy. There's so much more in the book that we really just couldn't cover in 1 hour. But there are so many examples of thought control. What's the truth about the man who killed John Lennon? Was he a Manchurian candidate of some sort? And Dr. Ross addresses this and many, many other issues in his book, Bluebird. I recommend it because you have to understand what's gone on in the past to really understand what's taking place today. Well, this is the time when I certainly want to remind our listeners that Radio Liberty is listener-supported, and now more than ever before, we need your help to extend our coverage out across America with the news behind the news, the story behind the story, the information you're not going to get from other sources. So if you agree there's a problem and you'd like to become part of the Radio Liberty family and help us as we reach out 5 hours every day on radio and shortwave, internet, satellite, on our weekend program that goes to 35 stations, why, give us a call at 1-800-544-8927. That's 1-800-5-HIV-WAR. And, of course, we hope that you will definitely consider joining the Radio Liberty family. If not, perhaps just taking our newsletter. If you'd like a free copy of the newsletter, we'll be glad to send you one. Just give us a call at 1-800-544-8927. And then please go to our website at radioliberty.com, and you can listen to our programs there on the Internet. You can pull down our newsletters, the other things we've written. But please tell others about our programs. Tell them about our Internet site. Encourage them to listen. A lot of people don't want to hear the truth today, but your job is to tell them. As we're told in Ezekiel 3 and Ezekiel 33, that we are to be the watchmen. We're to be the watchman on the wall, trying to awaken people as to the truth of what's going on. And you're the one who has to be responsible. And if you don't tell people, of course, their blood is on your hands. If they ignore what you say, why, their blood is on their hands. Because we're involved in a spiritual battle for the survival of Western civilization, for the survival of Christian civilization. We're moving rapidly towards a new world order, a new world religion. We're moving rapidly towards World War III. We're moving rapidly towards the loss of freedom at home here in response to the terrorist threat. Well, we just simply ask you to pray for America, to pray for our boys going into battle, to pray for the civilians, to pray the war will be over quickly and with as little loss as possible, to pray for our leaders and our ministers, to pray for revival. And then, of course, please remember to pray for Radio Liberty, my ministry, for our provision and protection. And remember, in times like this, the words of our Lord, "Lo, I will be with you, always, even unto the end of the world." And that is what keeps me going. Until tomorrow, at the same time, Dr. Stan, good night, and may the Lord be with you.